you want to come forward? Because you're good, very well. Thank you, Nikki. Morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. As you well know, there was a government announcement yesterday related to events. We don't fall into this particular area because we're an educational establishment and this is a seated event. So as long as we have social distancing, there's ventilation, and you're double vaccinated, it should be no issue. This is today's news. Next week we may have a different evolving situation depending what the government announces and makes some legislation comes into force or not. But we're quite happy. I myself will be sitting at the back, and I'll tell you why, because if I have the mask on now, I go into some spontaneous cough, which is really annoying. I don't want to make bother anybody, so that's the reason why I'm going at the back, not for any other reason. So please, mobile phones on silent or switched off. And thank you very much for coming in today. So we'll start. A very warm welcome to Beatrice Garcia, who's traveled all the way from Amsterdam to deliver this lecture to us today. Beatrice, as you may know, is a fine artist and illustrator, and if you don't know, you're certainly going to witness it during the lecture. She holds a first-class degree from Durham University and combines her artistic skills with a finance mindset. She's exhibited internationally in Madrid and London, and not least here locally in Gibraltar. Her work focuses on architecture and heritage, and quite importantly, its conservation. When we spoke yesterday, you actually coined the phrase, which is essentially safeguarding heritage through artwork.
Yeah, exactly.
But what another way of putting it.
Yeah.
There's no secret that Richard is Beatrice's father, so she's following her father's footsteps, and her father's been a speaker in all the 6 previous lecture series, and hopefully later on is here as well.
Yeah.
So
no pressure.
Yeah. So today's lecture focuses on the importance of cultural heritage and the evolution, how important the evolution that is for our species. So thank you very much, Beatrice, and over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. Good morning, can everybody hear me well? Okay, perfect. I have my phone here just to keep time because I could ramble on forever and we will try to keep it to an hour. But yeah, as Nadine mentioned, I'm a fine artist and illustrator. Originally born in Gibraltar, but now I'm currently based in Amsterdam. And this morning when you came in, you will have seen that there's a little card that was on your chair. And these are artworks of mine, and in particular there are 3 artworks. So the red cards are of a portrait that I did of the football player Viv Anderson. He was the first guy to play, first black player to play for England, so I was commissioned to do a portrait for him. The second one, which is predominantly blues, is of a doorway that I did in Gibraltar, the first ever exhibition that I had in 2017, and I was focused around heritage, looking specifically at the Japanese concept of kintsugi, which is essentially the idea that when items break in Japanese culture, rather than throw them away, they repair these items with gold because they believe that actually your flaws make you more valuable. Now the third illustration, which has the yellow grid around it, is a Brexit series that I did, which I exhibited in 2019, and that was my response to the Brexit. So I was looking at where Gibraltar's place was either inside or outside the European Union, using themes around Gib and that coloured grid as a metaphor for the European Union. So without further ado, we're going to get started. So as Nadine mentioned, I'm a heritage artist and illustrator. So I focus on creating art projects which focus on our heritage and our history. Why do I do that? Because I believe that our past is a gateway to our future, and there are important lessons that we can learn from it. All the accompanying artwork in today's talk has been done by myself. It's either personal projects or works that have been commissioned, and a lot of them are heritage scenes either around Gibraltar, or they will be UNESCO World Heritage sites around the world. It's all very typical for today's talk. And to illustrate a little bit what I do as a heritage artist, I want to talk to you about a recent project that I worked on, which was the Risa Bakery. So this is a site of 29 to 35 engineers thinking. When this building was demolished in Gibraltar, it was quite controversial because the heritage listed building was taken down, and the building that now replaces it doesn't match the style of the old town, which is allocated for under the Town Planning Act. So, one of the conditions for the new build of what's now the residence was that there be a display created in the lobby which safeguards the heritage of the site. So, on the right hand side, you can see a large painting that I did of what was the last tenants of this building, so the Risa Bakery. This is Manuel Risa and Sons facade. It's got a very dramatic cement render which has been painted red. And given that I painted a lot of scenes around the Gibraltar Old Town and not many are red, it was particularly fun to paint this one. So this is one of the elements of the display. But what may be of interest to you is that it wasn't the only bakery that was on the site. So in 1865, there existed a bakery called Manuel Gomez's Bakery, or also colloquially known as the Manolons. This was set up in 1865. So from 1865 until 1994, which is when the Risa Bakery vacated the site, there was 129 years of bread baked on that site. On the left-hand side, you can see a map from the Ordnance Survey, and although it may be a little bit small, I've put a little red dot where the site of 29 to 35 Engineers Lane is. This is to contextualize the site of the bakery within Gibraltar as a whole. The Manolons advert is quite remarkable in itself because at the time, in most of the adverts in the 1905 Gibraltar Directory were predominantly black and white. So this was one of the few colour adverts in the directory at the time, which seems to suggest that work was going well for the Manolons. The Manolons were also the first to convert the site into the layout that the Risa Bakery inherited. So originally there were some stables that adjoined the property, and they took those stables, converted them to more bakery ovens, and then took an old storage cupboard and converted that into the stables. When the Manuel Risa Bakery first moved into the site, which they inherited a quarter in 1924, this was a setup that they had inherited. So why are projects like this important? Projects like this are important because whilst I remember going to buy bread on Saturday mornings with my family, I'm sure many of you also frequented the Risa Bakery. In a couple of generations' time, there will not be much local knowledge about the Risa Bakery. So sites, displays like this are important to talk about the history of the Gibraltarians who came before, about the purposes for which the sites were used, and to also talk a little bit about our history. The Risa Bakery was still on the side of Engineers Lane despite the World Wars. Talks also not just about the Gibraltarians, but about our resilience and our continuance despite circumstances. So this is to give you an overview of the kind of projects that I do. And now we're going to move into the main body of the talk. So we're going to start with a definition of heritage. I think it's important to talk about what heritage is. It's a very large word. And then to look at the authorities that govern heritage currently. What is the criteria that they set themselves for what is heritage listed and what isn't heritage listed? Because obviously we cannot heritage list everything. Then we're going to look at 3 case studies. I'm taking 3 different UNESCO World Heritage sites from around the world, and through these 3 UNESCO World Heritage sites, I'm going to build up 3 pillars, which I believe are lessons that we can learn from heritage. These 3 pillars then form a framework that I'm going to use to look at local heritage. So we're going to look at who the main players are, and then we're going to look at what I call the dark side of heritage. In recent days, or not recent days, but recently there have been debates about certain aspects of heritage, and whilst I believe it's very important and I really see its value, I also think it's important to raise some of these issues and then look at ways in which we can work to mitigate these. And then finally, we're going to look at future heritage, and I'm going to make some suggestions about how locally we can further maximise and use our heritage. So let's get started. So what is heritage? So heritage is defined by Oxford Dictionary as an inheritance. It comes from the Old French words hériter, which through time evolved to héritage in Old French, and eventually became the Old English word that we use today, which is heritage. So it's about an inheritance. Normally this definition relates to property. It can also be denoting or relating to things of special architectural, historical, natural value that are preserved for the nation. So here already we're looking at two important points: the point of an inheritance and about something being preserved for a nation. So it's not just for us, it's for all of us. I think at this stage it's important to make a distinction between history and heritage, because whilst these topics are often used interchangeably, they complement each other, but they're not exactly the same. The etymology of the word history comes from the Old Greek histor, which was an old, learned, wise man. Over time, this word evolved to historia, which relates to stories, to narrative, and then through Latin became the English word that we use today, which is history. So history is about past events, it's about telling the story of past events, whereas heritage is about the items that we leave behind that may have been created during those past events that we are looking at preserving, not just for ourselves, but for generations to come. So who are the heritage authorities? Locally, we have the Gibraltar Heritage Trust. And internationally, we have what's called the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, which is more colloquially known as UNESCO. So UNESCO was founded on the 16th of November 1945, and its main purpose is to create a culture of peace, to eradicate poverty, to create sustainable development, and to encourage intercultural dialogue under the topics of education, science, and culture. Within that, there's a cultural branch, if you like, and this cultural branch was created on the 16th of November 1972, so 27 years after UNESCO was founded. And it was founded after a convention was passed for the protection of world's cultural and natural heritage. So what are the different types of heritage? We have various. On the screen, you can see two illustrations I've done. On your right-hand side, you can see an example of tangible heritage. So tangible heritage is something physical, and it has three subcategories within it. So you have the tangible, movable heritage. So these are items like coins, like sculptures, like paintings. You have tangible, immovable, which is exactly like the Sao Bento Cathedral that you can see there on the screen. So these tend to be monuments or buildings and other items of within the architecture. Then you also have intangible heritage, which is like the Granada flamenco dance. It relates to performing arts, to rituals, to the oral tradition. And then you have a third category, which is that of natural heritage. So, now we understand what heritage is. It's about taking something that we inherit, that we look after for another generation. We know the different types, whether it's tangible, intangible, natural. How does UNESCO decide what goes on their very extensive list? So they have 10 criteria, and depending on whether you're applying for a site that is of natural heritage or cultural heritage, depends on what criteria you need to meet. So this criteria is as follows. First one is that it be a masterpiece of human creative genius. The second, that it be an important interchange of human values on developments in architecture, in technology, or town planning. The third, that it be a unique or exceptional testimony to a civilization or a cultural tradition, either living or extinct. The fourth, that it be an outstanding example which illustrates a stage in human history. The fifth, that it be an outstanding example of a human settlement or human interaction with the environment. Sixth, that it be associated with events or living traditions of outstanding universal significance. The seventh, that it be a natural phenomenon or areas of exceptional beauty and aesthetic importance. The 8th, that would be an example of presenting stages of the Earth's history from a geological perspective. The 9th, that would be a stunning example of ongoing ecological and biological processes. And the 10th, that would be an important and significant natural habitat for the conservation of biological diversity. So as you see, there's a whole host of criteria, as I mentioned, depending whether it's a natural or a cultural heritage site, determines what criteria you need to meet. As I'm sure you're all aware, Gibraltar has its own UNESCO World Heritage site, so we did indeed meet some of that criteria. So now that we've looked at heritage, we have a basic understanding of what it is, the different types, the criteria that you need to work out whether something is heritage listed. Predominantly something about outstanding value that talks about our history, about our interaction not just with these masterpieces of human genius, but also our interactions with the natural world. Now we're going to have a look at some case studies. So as I mentioned earlier in the talk overview, I'm going to be using these 3 case studies to build up 3 pillars of heritage. Each pillar is determined by each UNESCO World Heritage site, and these are the lessons I believe we can learn from World Heritage. So the Yellowstone National Park is based in Wyoming in the United States of America, and it was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List in 1978. It's one of the first ever UNESCO World Heritage sites on the list, and it's also believed to be one of the first ever national parks in the world. It's extremely large, it's 3,472 square miles, and it's a very unique spot. According to history.com, it is a site that has been both seismically and geothermally active for many, many years. Here on the illustration, you can see the Grand Prismatic Spring, which is an example of one of these geothermal features. The colors may seem really crazy to you, but in reality, they're exactly like that. You have a bright blue in the center, edging out to an almost acidic fluorescent green, and as you go further out of the spring itself, the earth is a really strong ochre color. So these crazy colors created by nature naturally. So what does Yellowstone teach us? Let's talk first about Yellowstone and some facts about it. So Yellowstone was first opened on the 1st of March 1872, and 106 years later it was added to the UNESCO World Heritage List. It has more than 10,000 hydrothermal features like the Grand Prismatic Spring, and this is almost over half the world's geothermal features within this one park. Has 500 active geysers. Again, more than half the world's active geysers in this one park. Has 67 different species of mammal, 285 species of birds, of which 150 nests in Yellowstone. Has 290 waterfalls and over 1,000 miles of hiking trails. So it may be large, but for one park in the world, it definitely packs a punch. So what does Yellowstone teach us? Yellowstone teaches us that as a species, we are one part of a very, very large ecosystem. It teaches us about our social responsibility towards the natural environment and about how we need to protect it and conserve it. Because given the current climate issues, small changes in temperature like we're seeing now can have massive effects on the incredible biodiversity that we see within this park. So that leads me to the first pillar. First pillar is integrity. So heritage teaches us about social responsibility because we are looking up to something that we are then passing on. The second UNESCO World Heritage Site is a little bit closer to home. It's the Gorham's Cave Complex in Gibraltar. It's a fairly recent addition to UNESCO World Heritage List. It's inscribed in 2016. It's Gibraltar's first ever UNESCO World Heritage Site. And actually, the Gorham's Cave complex itself gets its name from the largest of the caves, which is Gorham's Cave. But it's actually made up of 4 caves within that one site. So it's Gorham, Vanguard, Hyena, and Bennett's Cave. The area shows 5 million years of geological change and shows important habits and lifestyles of the Neanderthals that were seen here in Gibraltar. So what does Gorham's Cave complex teach us? I believe that the inhabitants of Gorham's Cave started a series of chain reactions that can now be felt to this day. Our Neanderthals are called Nana and Flint, so I refer to them as that during this talk. So to illustrate this point, I'd like you to take a look at the room around you. So look at the floor on which your feet are pressing. The ceiling, which is protecting us from this really sticky clothes Levante day. The windows that, when it's not Levante and maybe it's cold, we can close to keep us warm. All these things that are within this room are here because somebody imagined them. Nana and Flint may not have imagined the walls around them and built them, just like we build our homes today, but they had enough creativity to think that maybe a cave would be a great shelter from wind, from rain, from heat. They were creative enough to look at their natural environment and fashion up tools so they could then use to go and hunt in that natural environment. They were creative enough to take the feathers that they collected from these animals that they hunted and then use them to adorn themselves. So what's the next pillar? The next thing that I believe UNESCO Heritage teaches us is imagination. Because I believe that through this creativity, that is what distinguishes us from our monkey ancestors. We can use these to solve problems, both large or small. The third site that we're going to be looking at today is the Historical Centre of Florence. It was inscribed on the UNESCO Heritage List in 1982. And the site itself is made up of 14th century walls and everything that is contained within it. So some of these walls are represented by gates or towers, and they extend as far as St. John the Baptist Church in the north, and in the south, the fort of San Giorgio. So why is Florence so important? It's the birthplace of the Renaissance. 3 of the most iconic artists that we still refer to nowadays were contemporaries in Florence at the time of the Renaissance. This was in age order: Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and then Raphael, who was the youngest of the 3. It's a place of exceptional artwork and architecture. It started a trend and a ripple effect that went through the whole of Europe. And it also has a wide collection of UNESCO World Heritage renowned art in this one location. So as you can see in the illustration, this is the old town, the historic centre itself, but I want to focus on one element, which is the Church of Santa Maria del Fiore, which you can see here in the centre of the image. This church was originally started to be built by Arnolfo di Cambio in the 13th century. It took them almost a whole century to build this cathedral, but when it was completed in the late 13th century, had one item that was missing, and that was the Duomo. So we had this beautiful church, but right above the altar, we had this massive gaping hole in the ceiling. So when it was sunny or when it would rain, the church would get incredibly wet. So in 1418, the elders of Florence decided to solve this problem by holding a competition, inviting people from all around Italy, not just France, to design a dome. They had a couple of issues. It was a very, very large dome, would have been the largest after the Pantheon, and they weren't sure they had nor the ideas or the scaffolding to even be able to support the building of such a structure. So in walks in not an architect, but a very hot-headed goldsmith called Brunelleschi. And he says, I have an idea. I'm going to build you not one dome, but two, and I'm going to do it with no scaffolding. But because it was a really competitive environment in Italy at the time, he wouldn't mention how he would do it. Just said, I'm going to do this for you, and you have to believe me. By some miracle, he wins the competition, and actually he won the greatest prize because the dome is still standing today. But I'm going to explain to you a little bit about how he went about building this remarkable dome. So the dome itself is based around the concept of a wooden barrel. Wooden barrel has iron supports to help hold the structure up. So what Brunelleschi proposed was to build a small dome on the inside that was made initially out of stone, heavier items, and then as you went up the dome, it would become lighter items like brick. This inner dome, which was not very attractive, was used as scaffolding or as support for then the much more beautiful dome that he built around it. Now, why is this dome so important? When this dome was built, it was a masterpiece. It still is. It's on the UNESCO World Heritage list. It set off new standards in how cathedrals are built. And the most remarkable thing of all is that not only did Brunelleschi build the dome, he also built all the machinery that he used to lift up all these heavy materials and take them up to the height of where the dome was being built. And it's believed that these hoists and systems of levers and pulleys that he had were unrivaled till the time of the Industrial Revolution. So what does this historical site teach us? This site teaches us about the third pillar, which is innovation. Because whilst you can have imagination to imagine things that aren't real, you need innovation, both the ideas and the means to make these imagined ideas a reality. So let's do a little recap. What are the three pillars? I believe that the three pillars that World Heritage teach us are, number one, integrity. So it's about social responsibility. The second pillar is about imagination, to imagine solutions for problems that we have in the real world. The third pillar is innovation, to take these imagined solutions and then make them a reality. So now that we've looked at these three pillars, we're going to have a look at local heritage. So, locally, heritage is run by the Gibraltar Heritage Trust, which was set up in 1987. It's an independent body which is entrusted with the preservation and promotion of Gibraltar heritage. Within the trust, there are a board of 12 trustees, of which 6 are government appointed and 6 are elected from members within the Gibraltar Heritage Trust. Under the Heritage and Antiquities Act of 2018, the Council is believed to have a couple of functions. First, to promote, conserve and protect Gibraltar heritage. The second, to foster an understanding and facilitate the enjoyment of that heritage. The third, to advise on anything done in relation to antiquities or objects of interest, and to ensure that sustainable practices are used when dealing with these antiquities. The fourth is that they need to identify present and future issues which may need addressing. And the third is to consult with owners of monuments or buildings. And at present, the way the structure works is that the Heritage Trust and this council consults the Minister on matters relating to heritage. So that's their roles and responsibilities. And I believe that within Gibraltar, we have an additional subcategory of heritage. So we have tangible, intangible, natural, and I also believe that in Gibraltar we have civilian heritage, and we also have military heritage. This building is an example of military heritage. Some examples potentially of civilian heritage locally could be the churches that were built in Gibraltar, the Cathedral St. Mary the Crowned, Holy Trinity, the barracks here in Gibraltar, the Old Naval Hospital, which has been recently converted. Those are all examples of military heritage. So now that we've set the context of the local scene, who's responsible for heritage, we're going to look at some of the dark sides of heritage. Especially locally, especially internationally with the Black Lives Matter movement and the questions that it has raised about history and about heritage. I think it's important to talk about the way in which heritage used to be acquired. In the times when new lands were explored by land or by sea, explorers would come into new territories and they would take over these places. They would pillage the towns, they would sometimes take over the locals and use them to engage in the slave trade, and the heritage that they took from those countries, sometimes nowadays, has still not been returned to the countries in which they were originally found. So we're in a situation where if heritage means identity, and if we're meant to be preserving items for future generations of our nation, how can we preserve these items if we don't currently have possession of them? So that's the first issue that plagues heritage. The second is with regards to the unequal spread of scarce resources. The 15th of April 2019, the roof of the Notre Dame in Paris burnt down. Almost overnight, 750 million euros were pledged to help rebuild the roof. And whilst it's an icon of French heritage and of French identity, it also asks you to question about the poverty that exists not just in Paris but in France as a whole, and about the distribution of this spread of income. According to Oxfam, the world's richest 1% have more than twice the wealth of 6.9 billion people. This is staggering when you think that the world population, as it currently stands, is 7.9 billion. So here we have these beautiful heritage sites, but there's a conflict of ethics, because you have people that are hungry in your country, that are maybe living on a couple of euros a day, and then we also have these heritage sites with huge funds of money being pumped into them. Difficult issues, and these are some of the issues that heritage faces. The third issue is an environmental one. These beautiful buildings, while state-of-the-art at the time in which they were built, nowadays aren't of the most energy efficient. They require a lot of energy to heat up and warm up in the winter. In the summer, they require extensive cooling systems. As a result, these buildings end up taking up a lot more energy than necessarily a more modern built building. So these are the issues. No sector is ever perfect, but I think it's important to look at them and think about not necessarily how we can find a solution to them, because I think these issues are massively complex and it will be really reductionist to try to just one solution to each of these issues, but to look at ways we can mitigate some of these issues. So for example, in terms of the giving back of heritage to the countries in which they were found, a Gibraltar example, one of our Neanderthal skulls still lives in London. And whilst we're in the process of getting it back, there needs to be more initiatives that look at returning this heritage to places in which they were found. There was also quite a high-profile exhibition in London of Egyptian items that were then also returned to Egypt. Some work is being done, but I think that there still needs to be a lot of work done to look at ways in which some of this heritage can be repatriated. obviously it's a highly complex issue because it depends on factors like political stability within the countries themselves, whether they even have the financial resources to be able to maintain this heritage to a certain standard once they have it returned. But in instances where they're able to, I believe that it's only right that items go back to the communities in which they were found. Because at the end of the day, just as the Notre Dame is an emblem of being a French person, so is the skull for us. Looking at the unequal spread of scarce resources, perhaps the French authorities need to make an accurate assessment of how much money is it going to require to build this roof. And if they find that they have resources left over, find ways to pump that back into local communities to help not just Paris's poorest, but the whole of France's poorest. There are ways and means of doing it, and I believe that it's still ongoing. We still have no idea how much it's going to cost. But if they can pump some of that income back into people that need it the most, not only are they preserving the heritage and the identity of the French, they're also safeguarding and looking after their own economy. Because whilst we need to preserve heritage for the future, we shouldn't be sacrificing our current citizens for this heritage. There needs to be a balance. And then in terms of environmental considerations, maybe we should look at a blended heritage approach. Gibraltar does this fantastically. All this glass that exists within this building are simple solutions that help to isolate the building and make it more environmentally friendly, but without losing the spirit and the structure of the building itself. So that's the dark side. I think it's important that we look at heritage with open eyes. It's very fantastic and it brings a lot of value, but we need to talk about these issues. But now I'd like to move on to future heritage, to look at Gibraltar heritage. So here on the left, we've got a very brightly coloured map, and this is a source that I took from the Gibraltar Development Plan 2009. I colour-coded it because personally I found the map incredibly confusing, and I think if you colour-code it at a quick glance, you can see the different zones of Gibraltar. And I'm going to explain to you what each of these zones represents, what area Gibraltar represents. So Zone 1 is the old town. Zone 2 is the Bayside West Side area. Zone 3, the Port and Harbour. Zone 4, the east side. Zone 5, the north front. Zone 6, the North District. Zone 7, Europa Point and the Europa area, in this electric green colour. Zone 8 is the South District, which is in that deep blue, I believe. And then Zone 9 is the nature reserve. So let's look at these zones of Gibraltar first and think about the heritage of Gibraltarians. Our name comes from Tariq, a Moorish leader who came to Gibraltar in 711. How does our architectural style reflect some of that Moorish heritage? We have some buildings in the Irish town which have a Riyadh-like quality, if you like them, with a patio in the centre. We have the mosque here in Europa Point. Perhaps we have these vaulted ceilings that maybe you could say nod to Islamic architecture. Or the windows of the old police station at the top of Irish Town. What about our current architecture? How does that reflect our Moorish heritage? What about Zone 4, which is where a lot of the fishermen that came over from Genoa came to Gibraltar? How does that reflect our fisherman heritage? I was in Faro not too long ago, and there are these fantastic street art murals talking about fishermen and fish, and talking about the flavour of Portugal, which is, it's a country by the sea. It gets a lot of benefit from the sea, and they were talking about that heritage there through their street art. It's been a great initiative in Gibraltar by an artist called Jap Jap, who's made some murals in the old town. I don't know if you would have seen them, and they are figures from the 17th, 18th, 19th century, and those give a snapshot of the Gibraltarians that would have been in Gibraltar at the time. What if we did something similar in Zone 4, and we did something similar that talks about the fishermen who live there? I think Zone 1 is very well protected. It's the old town. Under the Town Planning Act, there's provision already for it about the style of the buildings. The buildings that are built there need to reflect the style that was created by Milanese architect Borchetti when he first came to. The nature reserve is also an area that's very well protected. But what about the other zones? What are we doing about them? What about our military heritage? What about these wonderful arches that we have all around Gibraltar? How are we incorporating some of those styles into the architecture that we're building nowadays? Repurposing heritage buildings is also an important aspect. For example, the City Hall used to have a dining hall in the 19th century. And then that was removed. What if we reinstated that dining hall so that when visitors came to Gibraltar, important dignitaries that came for important aspects of our cultural calendar, they could come and sit in a piece of Gibraltar history that sits in an area on which there is John McIntosh Square, and you have 3 heritage listed buildings in that area. You've got the City Hall itself, you then have the main guards, diagonally opposite it, where the Heritage Trust currently exists and sits, and then you also have the Exchange Building, where the Gibraltar Parliament is. Wouldn't that be a best place to host people in a piece of Gibraltar history? What about all the other rooms that are currently offices? What if we could find a way to repurpose them to maybe make what you see in other European cities, what they call Casa Museo, where you show what a Gibraltarian house would have looked like in the time and give people a flavour of how we lived, especially during all the different stages of our varied history. Wouldn't that be interesting? Because we're a highly multicultural society, and I believe that currently our heritage offering doesn't reflect that. Brand Gibraltar is about monkeys, but Gibraltar is so much more than that. It's so much more than just a finance centre and about monkeys. What if we could look at a way to promote more of that heritage? What if we use some of the rooms to take some of the items that have been resubmitted on the Ministry of Heritage websites and showcase them? So when tourists came in, they'll come into a central building in the centre of Main Street and immediately get a snapshot of what we have on offer. What about our new builds? What are we building currently in Gibraltar which reflects our heritage? I believe that we should be looking maybe at, architects used to use what they used to call a source book, where there would be different architectural styles, and then they would take some of these features, where it would be a vaulted window or an arch, and they would say, okay, I'm going to design a building that has some of these elements together. What if part of the brand Gibraltar included an identity for our heritage? So when people come to Gibraltar, we don't just look like any other town anywhere. The old town is fantastic, it gives us one snapshot of our heritage, but what about the rest of it? And I think it's really important that we work closely with property developers to create buildings that look like they're in Gibraltar. We want buildings that look like they're here and not in Singapore or in Beijing or anywhere else in the world. And I think whilst it's really important to conserve our current heritage, what are we doing that's providing something that future generations will inherit? I don't think it's simply enough to be able to just look after what's come before. We need to be building these new masterpieces that maybe UNESCO would turn around and say, wow, this is definitely worth being on the list. And fine, these buildings are more expensive, but we could use them as a tourist product. the current tourism offering in Gibraltar is good, but it's a bit disparate. What if we could find a way to take all these heritage sites and create walks around them, or an app where people can download it, and on different buildings they can scan a QR code and have an audio tour of some of the different sites around Gibraltar? What if we found ways to improve the transport system so we can make some of this amazing heritage more accessible? Places like Parsons Lodge, which are fantastic buildings but which don't get used much and which is very hard to access, and even if you get there, where do you park? So we need to also look at these infrastructural changes, and if we can do that, perhaps we can change the tourists in Gibraltar, which tends to come in over land or over sea, and only stay for a day. Sometimes we don't even stay for the night. Perhaps if we had more of these kind of offerings, they decide to extend their stay by a day. Just imagine the tourism revenue we can then generate by having them here for that one extra day. The Heritage Trust needs to have more power, needs to be able to more actively protect Gibraltar heritage, so that buildings like the Residence would look more like the style of the Old Town, rather than something that doesn't fit in within the personality of the Old Town. They need to have more say in the town planning, and they need to be able to advise and to, irrespective of the administration that's currently in Pound Gibraltar, make sure that heritage is always on the agenda. Because at the moment, whilst they have certain things that they're meant to do, like promote and protect the heritage, if we don't give them sufficient power in order to be able to do that, then they're not able to fulfill their duties. And as we mentioned, heritage isn't for us. Heritage is for future generations. We enjoy it whilst we have it. But like an old watch, we pass it down from generation to generation. So let's talk about our future heritage. Let's look again at the pillars of integrity, imagination, and innovation. What are we doing in Gibraltar to fulfill our social responsibility to future generations? To make sure that we're building new buildings that could be considered heritage districts, but which also take into account the environmental considerations by ensuring that they are energy efficient, but also in keeping with this brand Gibraltar. What about imagination? Where are our ideas to build more complex, more beautiful buildings that then could become symbols for Gibraltar internationally? And where are the innovative people that can take these crazy ideas, wacky ideas, and turn them into reality? If we're doing one of these items, or if we're maybe not doing any of them at all, maybe we should ask ourselves why we're not doing that. Thank you. Is actually for sale. So if you saw one that you particularly liked, as I was talking through, they're available for purchase from my website. So thank you. Questions? Yes?
So do you have the microphone? Or we don't?
No, I don't.
No.
You can take your mask and have a breather if you wish. If you're really, really warm, just... I'm going to turn the lights off a second because perhaps it's cooler. Is that okay?
First of all, Beatrice, thank you very much for a beautiful lecture, very nicely delivered, very calm and collected, and with lots of common sense, and with all the images are beautiful as well. I'm chairman of the Heritage Trust, so
nice.
so I feel as if I'm not able to deliver half of the things that you're suggesting should be delivered. For somebody who is, you know, of a younger generation than myself, and
Yeah.
you know, who still has to experience the sort of the realities of Gibraltar, I think it's a very balanced lecture, because it puts forward ideas, many of which have been expressed at some time or another by different entities, including the Trust. But there are lots of elements there which, you know, are very difficult to deliver in reality. I'm saying this just as a general topic for everybody. I mean, first of all, some of the issues about responsibilities within the Heritage Trust. The Heritage Trust was formed initially when there was so much being lost of heritage in real terms that, you know, groups of individuals who were interested came together to form the Conservation Society initially, and then eventually that evolved into the Trust as we see it today. The reality is that, you know, the terms of the Trust's responsibilities are very broad and sound very effective, but the reality is very different to that. And you say, well, maybe we ought to have more responsibilities or more, you know, being able to make people accountable to the heritage scene in Gibraltar. That's, you know, in the present circumstances, very difficult. First of all, the Trust is run by volunteers. Well, we've got a few permanent staff, but the board itself is volunteers. One little correction is that it's no longer 6 and 6, it's now 7 and 5.
Oh, good to know.
7 who are not placed there by the government of the day, but 5 that are.
Yeah.
The Trust, you know, has got, you know, a voice within the Development and Planning Commission, which is really where a lot of the issues come to the fore in Gibraltar regarding, you know, potential loss of heritage. But it is one voice amongst 12.
Yeah.
And although many of the NGOs have the same kind of conservative approach to Gibraltar, both with heritage, natural, you know, like people like GON, CSG in Gibraltar, you know, at the end of the day, there are a lot of heavyweight government pressure, in a sense, from ministers. There's also members of the government organisations there, and so therefore the balance between free thinking of what you think is right and is wrong is not quite there. It certainly is hugely better than it was in previous under previous administrations, but you know, there's still issues there. And of course, you know, although we are a group of volunteers, you know, the size of the Heritage Department within Gibraltar, you know, the government Heritage Department is extremely small. I mean, you've literally got 2 or 3 individuals, you know, and trying to give them the responsibilities to you know, try and manage the heritage agenda in Gibraltar is that. I've always said this, that it's all about political will.
Yeah.
You know, the politicians need to sense that there is enough public backing for many of the concepts of heritage to try and push that forward. And unfortunately, you know, finances are always the thing that sort of catches Gibraltar out. You know, a lot of areas for development are brought up because they create money for Gibraltar, either in the forms of premiums or in the forms of income tax receipts, etc., etc. And so therefore, you know, there's that constant battle between you know, getting value out of development. You're absolutely right about the quality of architecture in Gibraltar. It is minimalist architecture, you know, on the excuse that it's modern, and the fact that everything has to be modern, even if it's an attachment to an old building. You know, it is also the you know, things that won't last into future generations. Many of them, you know, polystyrene and cardboard.
One again, that all involves a cost, which potentially means they're more expensive in the long term. But
So,
I think maybe it's also about talking to politicians about how actually they do have a backing in the Gibraltarian community.
Well, they definitely do.
And, oh, sorry. And that actually there are a lot more people interested in heritage that perhaps they think, and that actually it is a vote winner. And I agree with you that it does come down to politics. But if they could see that it's part of their agenda, I think a lot of positive things could be done. But I think there are also ways of getting back premiums, but building things in a way that in the long term will also bring back more revenue to Gibraltar.
Oh, I'll leave it there because I could be talking
No, thank you. It's very
all day,
interesting.
and then I'll be sabotaging your lecture.
No, you can't do your own one. So, any other questions?
I have one. I usually do. It's actually joining both of you together.
Yeah.
So you're highlighting the not sightness, but the issues of the day in terms of how not really jacket that you are in terms of the Heritage Trust, but you can't push it forward because the political will needs to be there in the first instance. You mentioned heritage tourism.
Yeah.
Also. So would a collaboration with the Heritage Trust and the tourism agency perhaps highlight this better? And then the government of the day will see how much tourism will come into Gibraltar and perhaps give more focus to that as an entry, an avenue into
I can tell you
highlighting this.
I can tell you the Heritage Trust has put forward various assessments of the tourist product, the heritage tourist product in Gibraltar, particularly in the Upper Rock area, which is the one where it's most concentrated, and giving lots of ideas and suggestions. It has been received, with thanks, but not, I would say, with a lot of immediacy to try to look at solutions. One thing that I have to say from my experience is that politicians don't like to be told what to do. They like to make up their own minds, and they like to have the ideas. So, where people who've got no other interest, no vested interests other than the benefit of Gibraltar, such as the Gibraltar Heritage Trust, and I'm sure there are other organisations, the government has to listen to them, and they should do, because we're not there to just wave the heritage flag. It's about trying to make Gibraltar progress and benefit from the products that we have, which are unique. They're unique, but they're not delivered at their best. And you talked about the transport of tourism. These are vital issues, because
it's an infrastructure change that needs to happen.
and the accommodation of rather the encouragement of people to stay, because the 4-hour tour, the 4-hour stay in Gibraltar for either because of the buses bringing them in, or in the old days when we had cruise liners, it's just not enough. It's a whiz round Gibraltar and that's it. And it's a very superficial, very inferior sort of version of the true tourist.
Yeah.
So there are lots of things. We are working behind the scenes constantly trying to make change. We do achieve little by little, very slowly, but we are trying.
Yeah, it's good. Thank you.
It's just going back to what you were saying about something being iconic in Gibraltar,
Yeah.
and using that in various ways. One of the things that a lot of people love and comment to is the old awnings in colonial buildings
Yes.
with the pillars and that and could that not be incorporated perhaps in other buildings and even in Chiringuitos? Instead of having the same old as everywhere else and having a veranda that is just a plastic thing, why aren't our Chiringuitos in Gibraltar iconic? So when somebody comes to the beach to Gibraltar, he knows he's in Gibraltar and not anywhere else.
That's true.
Because our Chiringuitos would have these canopies, which would be the outside areas, and they have the ones that, the type of awnings that you see in colonial buildings.
Yeah.
And that could be used right through as an iconic thing of one of the iconic things of Gibraltar, because it's something that does happen in other places. I've seen it in Bermuda, I've seen it in Barbados, but not here.
Yeah. Well, and little things like that are things we can add to the architecture. So exactly little points like that. But I agree that it's not just the talk maybe is just the beginning. Maybe I don't need to go and
ideas,
send messages about,
You
yeah.
actually brought it to my thinking of that.
But maybe now there needs to
Sometimes to hear somebody, as you
be, yeah.
wanted to, putting these ideas through, ideas that have probably gone through other older people's, heads and think, well, nobody's ever going to think of that. It's just dead loss. But
it's about the players that hold purse strings, about having them see the value of it. I think if we can do it that way, and maybe even make them think that, sure, it was their idea from the beginning, fine. At the end of the day, it's about Gibraltar heritage, and as long as it's protected, Sorry, Claire, this is,
I just want to add to what you were saying and what you were great talk. A lot of the things is like exactly the same sort of vocabulary and lesson. I think in the past we've never really valued our built architectural heritage for what it is. Of an actual heritage is always been seen as just so plain and plain about balconies and that kind of thing. But we discuss with architects all the time, and we've picked up comments in reports where they say there is nothing architecturally of value about this building. And we're like, have you actually walked around? Have you looked at it? Have you understood talks like this? And lately, over the past 10 years with the university, there's a lot of awareness building yourself to bring up that awareness, and this sort of talk should be given directed at architects and developers, the Development Planning Commission. I think we need to hear this.
Make coverage from the source book.
Voices, yeah.
Exactly. Oh, and what about tiles? There's some beautiful buildings on Main Street that got tiles in them that talk about it. The Portuguese originally came to Gibraltar.
It's all about lack of knowledge because it's never really been out there. I mean, you talk about the source book. About 15 years ago, we put one together with the urban conservation officer that worked for government at the time, and it never got published because it got politically charged. And it's that all the time. But if anything will get out, and I think over time, but in the meantime, you have to try and go back the tide.
Yeah.
I particularly loved the idea of how people used to live that were proposed.
Yeah.
Because I think that like the Janito culture is getting put upon quite a lot. I mean, albeit through education, amalgamation, etc. But if you actually analyse the proper Janito culture, like, sometimes you say, un pedacito keki. And you talk to people, if you talk to people that aren't Janito, they'll say, it's a keki.
Yeah.
And when you explain the linguistics of
the
Janito culture, I think bit by bit that is being put upon.
Yeah.
And I think it's quite sad that through snobbishness, or I don't know how to explain it, but through different influences, that should be lost. And I think if that's lost, we'll lose our heritage.
Yeah.
Albeit not in the physical sense, but so much spiritually of the Janito culture will go. And I think it's important to do, like you suggested, bring that to the fore as well, bring to the fore the fishing village in Captain Bay, the amalgamation of all the different influences that we've had over a period of time, but really start bringing that up to the fore.
And all the little subgroups that now make up this multicultural society that is the Gibraltarian culture.
Exactly.
We need to be talking about each of these individually and saying this combines to make our combined personality.
Yeah, because I know when I've spoken to tourists, they've been fascinated by that. They've been completely fascinated. And of course it does bring everything together, I think.
Yeah.
That cultural level with heritage does bring it together and makes it more valuable.
Completely. I think
so.
People understand us more, and it also ends up making a more lasting impression. Because you go to a place and you think, oh wow, okay, there's all these little factors that make this melting pot, this massive limestone rock that doesn't even look like maybe it should even be there. You're coming around from from the top of the way, and it's just this massive rock sticking out, and we are unique, and we should be championing that more. I think we need to find a way to make the profit agenda, which is what has been governing Gibraltar for a long time, and also I understand why we have a profit agenda, But find a way to marry that with heritage and talk about how actually having these little tweaks, like these unique shinghitos, can bring tourists over, you know.
Yeah. And you know, the amalgamation with the beautiful natural side that we've got to, like now it's prime immigration for the fin whales.
Yeah.
Those kind of things. I mean, I've been fin whale watching at your other point, and the tourists have been using me as a source of income and being totally fascinated, you know, and you know, and about the so you know, it's like the Aboriginals.
We have to set you up as a tour guide.
No.
Can I give you a help on that one? If you go down to a dwelling, I promise you, you'll be okay all over the place. But another thing that we also forget about is our food.
Oh, really?
When you go to Italy, okay, where do you go to eat? To a restaurant.
Yeah.
And you look around the restaurant, you eat Italian food. You look around the restaurant, who's eating in the restaurant? But never mind the tourists. Other Italians are eating.
Yeah.
You go to France, they eat French food.
Yeah.
Go to they eat Portuguese food.
Yeah.
Where is our food? There is
So we need like, I agree that we need to sit down restaurants.
I did a program of 20 episodes, and each episode there was two different dishes. I researched those dishes to make sure that either it was uniquely Gibraltarian or the ingredients that had been substituted were uniquely Gibraltarian. I could have done loads more, but there was only 20. We started for 5 episodes and we ended up with 20. Now, if I could do that years ago with very little available research and just doing what was available, yet when people come to Gibraltar and they say, oh, you need fish and chips, or you need potato frito. No, that is not our heritage. Our heritage is 1,000 times more than that.
But it's one element of it.
I
one element.
But when people, I'm in my shop, tourists come to ask me, where can we go and eat? And I say, well, what do you want to eat? They said, well, we want to eat your food. And I say, well, you'll have to come home with me. There isn't a restaurant, yes, there's takeaways in the States, but there isn't a restaurant in town where you can sit down and have a vinaigrette, and have a rotto, have things that are everyday, you know, a stupid, simple thing like saltfish. Wherever you go in the world, you get saltfish grilled. The only place in the world that you get pan now is in Gibraltar. Can you eat it in the street? No. Why? Why are we so ashamed of our food? When it's an icon of Gibraltar.
I think there was a comment at the front as well.
Hi, thank you for this. I really enjoyed it. I think what I'm hearing from lots of people actually is that we need to do something to educate the young people, because it's about citizenship, isn't it? If people don't care, it's not going to happen in the future. And I feel maybe, I don't know much about you, but I think the reason you care is because you have that family influence at home.
Yeah.
So, but not everybody's got that.
Yeah.
So we need to do something to ensure that the future politicians and the future restaurant owners care about heritage. And the only way to do that is through education and get into the schools.
But I think education as well on multiple levels, because we're not training Gibraltar architects that love the buildings around them, that can pick up the styles that we have in Gibraltar, then we end up with the buildings that we have currently.
But how do they get that love for those styles in those buildings? You've got to start young. I brought Lily with me, she's only 7. I think maybe it was a bit too much for her. You know, I'll talk to her afterwards and give her a quick summary of what happened here. But I think that's what we need to do, isn't it? Get the young people to care and get them to feel that citizenship.
This is great, we're having a really good debate.
The last 3 questions, please. So 1, 2, and 3.
Yeah.
It would be really good if the governments, of whichever government is in at the time, would actually maintain some of the heritage buildings that we have. They're very, very lax at keeping the maintenance up on them. Because there's more of the other rock and they didn't
Have a look at this building. Look at the lighting. For example, we got the Heritage Award 2015. So even the copper pipes, the leaves, everything is, you know. There was a lecture, Caroline did the lecture last week, so to make sure that we sustain the heritage. So, you know, this is a real focus in allowing our building to kind of be iconic and represent the history of Gibraltar for hundreds and centuries of years going forward. I think you have to have a real passion and want to do that, and I think that's the message that we have to put forward, that we have to create that passion, or at least make it very live. Sorry to interject, this is a typical example of what we want.
Yeah, completely, exactly. We want this style of blended heritage around Gibraltar. I think as well the archers, they did a fantastic job. They had to put in lifts for disability access, but instead of putting them inside the building, put them on the outside, in glass, in blue glass.
I used to live there, and the apartment that I lived in sold for over £1 million. But mine was a government flat.
Yeah.
But when I was a government flat, they didn't come through.
Yeah. But it's just proof that these buildings are of value. The Gibraltar property market is very lucrative. We should be living in items of heritage. Yeah, sorry.
So thank you. Just a comment and
Take your mask off, please.
Oh, sorry. Me? Oh,
Yeah,
so thank you, really inspiring lecture, that's brilliant, and really, really good, and it's made me think about things as well. I'd say I'm inspired by Gibraltar, Gibraltarians, and my best friend. I came here for 6 months, that's 24 years ago.
Wow.
But the thing about, as I say, and say as a sort of a foreigner coming in, but I think you kind of adopted me by now, but I worked with the Gibraltarians, the nation of entrepreneurs, you guys, because of everything you've had to face over centuries and last centuries, decades. And that everyone will find a way through. Gibraltar will find a way through, and we all thrive. But for me, there's the thing of there's so much has gone on, and it's the confidence of trying to survive. So 40, 50 years ago, people living all together, how are we going to get through the military moving out, 70% GDP, what are we going to do? And I think there's still that bit of right, we've still got to survive. Despite the budget the other day, we're one of the top GDP per head in the world. The money is coming through, the money's there. For me, I suppose the question is, should there be, one, the independence for the Heritage Trust, and I think you were getting to that, I think you were saying, but two, government, a bit like the government in the UK has done with foreign aid things, which are controversial, but saying, should there be a minimum, like 1% or something that goes guaranteed, no matter what the administration, goes to heritage, and that the independence takes that on and does it, because there's money in Gibraltar. And so there's so much here. I find so much stuff each day, I find it incredible.
Yeah, but it's about incentivizing the right people, and I think at the end of the day, that's the bottom line. That's where we need to start. The decision makers, if they're not on side, nothing's going to change. So whilst I can come and do this talk, the next stage is actually to talk to those people that make the decisions. And it's only when you hit that stage that real change is going to happen. Because otherwise, I can keep talking to the cows come home, but if we don't do something about this and talk to the people that control and govern these things, someone else will be having this conversation, 20, 30 years time. So
I'd vote for you to run the government.
I know. Don't be important in politics. I think politics is very messy, and it's actually easier to influence things from outside. But thank you.
Another question.
Yes.
I think it's more of a comment than a question.
Yeah.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for the lecture. It's really nice, really informative, and it's nice to actually be in a lecture in person after 2 years.
Yeah.
I really found your comment regarding how heritage and identity is the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was really, really important.
Yeah.
And I think perhaps the correlation that we're seeing with the lack of incentives in keeping traditional heritage sites, not sites as such as architecture, is possibly due to post-colonialism and the fact that they want to erase the history of Gibraltar and all the violence and the rape, etc., that did happen previously. It does happen a lot in post-colonial places, so they do like to erase the past.
Yeah.
And I think it is really important to try and get the beautiful parts of the past and try and incorporate them in future. So I just wondered if there's a correlation between post-colonialism and trying to preserve heritage in the future.
Perhaps there's an aspect as well with a lot of the MOD slowly being, moved out of Gibraltar. But I think that our history is our history. Thankfully, the Black Lives Matters conversation is happening because, there are some apologies that need to be handed out, especially, in New Zealand and all these places, all these Aboriginal communities that were persecuted, their children taken away from them and sent to these schools and naturalized, whatever on earth that means. I think it's important to talk about it, but I think that there's a way in which we can talk about it where we, you know, we look at the Middle Ages, we look at other dark parts of history, you know, we haven't stopped talking about it. I think he was a horrible person. I think the point is it's an element of history. It's not about taking away that history, but it's about saying that history has made us who we are today, and as a result, this is what we're doing about it. And I think the future heritage piece is really important, because whilst we have beautiful buildings like this, we also need to be thinking about what are we building now that we're going to be leaving behind. That's really important. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Very much. One question, what is your favourite part of food?
Thing is, I actually really like where the airport stores used to be, Turnbull's Lane. I love all these old buildings with the blue-eye balconies and the Portuguese tiles. That for me is personally like some of my favourite architecture. Yeah. Thank you.